Hello and welcome back to Owls of the Okanagan and Simlkameen Part 2. My name is Leah McKinnon and I'm going to be presenting this webinar on behalf of the Okanagan Simlkameen Stewardship Society. If you missed Part 1 and you're interested in owl biology, then by all means go check it out on our website. So over the course of this webinar, I'm going to talk about how to identify some of our local owls. I won't talk about all of our local owls just because there are a lot of them. What are some of the threats to our local owls and how you can help owls? There are 14 species of owl in the Okanagan and Simlkameen, and they're quite variable. So they range in size from the great gray owl, which is more than 2 feet tall. So if you picture 2 of the gallon milk jugs stacked on top of each other, that still wouldn't be quite as tall as a great gray owl. And our smallest owl is the flammulated owl, which would fit inside sort of like a medium to go coffee cup. So under 7 inches tall. So in addition to being very different in size, they also differ some in their biology. All of our owls are predators, so they're all eating other animals, but which animals they're eating is dependent on species. Some of our owls are migratory, whereas some are resident. Some of our owls are very common and some are quite rare. Even some of the common owls you're quite unlikely to see because they're more active at night than they are during the day, and they're very well camouflaged. Some owl species are very tolerant of people and are quite willing to live in suburban areas, whereas others don't do very well with disturbance at all. And they all use slightly different habitats. So some are grassland birds, whereas some are really forest birds. So in the next part of this, I'm going to go over some of the species and how to ID them. And I'll try and give you some tips about where they might be found. And just in case you thought we were joking about the flammulated owl fitting in a coffee cup, this is a photo from the Burrowing Owl Conservation Society. While they're doing banding, they weigh their owls, and this is a picture of a baby burrowing owl being weighed in a coffee cup. So that owl is about full grown at that size. So before I jump into our owl species, I'm going to talk a little bit about what to look for, and there is also a slideshow of owls that's available on the same page as our webinars. It has all 14 owl species that can be found in the Okanagan and Simlkameen. Some of those species are quite rare and not necessarily here every year. But if you're really persistent and lucky, you can get all of those owl species ticked off living here. And the way that that slideshow is set up is so that if you wanted to go through and try and ID the birds on your own with your field guide, the first thing that flashes up is a picture, and you can take your time and look at that with your field guide. And then if you advance the slide or click on it, the next thing that will come up is a few tips to help you with ID. And then if you click again, it will give you the name so you can see if you were right or not. So I'm going to go through some of our species that are very common and some of our species that are at risk. There's species that are rare, but not necessarily at risk here. So they're just naturally not very common in the Okanagan. And we won't talk about those just because of time constraints, because this is going to get very long if I go through all 14. So there's a couple of owl species here for you to look at. And you can see that the one on the right has a little tuft on its head. So that's one thing to look for, is whether or not the owls do have any tufts on their heads. This guy in particular is a western screech owl, and depending on how they're sitting and what their posture is, they can be more or less obvious. But it is a good characteristic to look for. If you're close enough or you have a good enough picture, one thing to look for is eye color. So the owl on the left here is a barred owl, and you can see that it has completely black eyes, as well as that round head. So those are good things to start by looking for, is the head shape and the eye color. and the size as well, because as we said, there's quite a large variation in size in some of these owls. So the first and probably most common owl species in the Okanagan is the great horned owl. This is a very large owl species. They're about 2 feet tall. They're very tolerant of people, so you will often find them in suburban neighborhoods. They start nesting around January, February. So right now, I'm recording this in early February. And right now, if you go out for a walk at night, it's quite common to hear them calling. So I'm going to play their calls for you. This is the kind of traditional hooting call that you think of when you think of an owl. This is a pair that is calling back and forth to one another. You can hear that one of the calls is higher pitched than the other. And the female owls generally have a higher pitched call than the male. So just like in people, women's voices tend to be higher than men's voices. Same thing, but with owls. So a mnemonic to remember their call is "Who's awake? Me too." And if you look at the picture, there's a circle over their ear tufts. They look fairly similar to the long-eared owl. The long-eared owl is quite a bit smaller, and the ear tufts are set closer together in the middle of their heads. So we're not going to talk about long-eared owls in this presentation, but you can find them in your field guide. You can find them in that slideshow that I talked about. The other call that you often hear from great horned owls is more of a screechy or screamy call. Generally, if anyone thinks that they have screech owls on their property, what they actually have is great horned owls. Our screech owls, Western screech owls, don't actually screech, and we will get to them later. So this is what an immature owl sounds like if it's begging for food, and sometimes the female will also make this noise, sort of in the winter time. So great horned owls, they're residents, they're around year-round. They're starting to breed in January and February. You will find them in suburban neighborhoods. There have been some breeding, right in downtown Penticton. They're really not worried about people at all. This is the barred owl. So we saw him on the what to look for when IDing owl slides. The barred owl is another very large owl. As we said in that slide, rounded face with no horns and black eyes. These guys have vertical striping on their chests. They're very similar to spotted owls, but you're not going to see a spotted owl. So biologists estimate that there's only 6 spotted owls left in BC, and they're not found in the Okanagan. But if you would like to learn more about spotted owls, check out the Spotted Owl Breeding Program, and their website is at the bottom. An interesting fact about barred owls is that they were originally native to Eastern Canada and the US, and they moved westward with people in what's called assisted migration. People didn't catch owls and release them in the West, but people planted shelter belts and hedgerows throughout the prairies, which barred owls could use as stepping stones to get to habitat that suited them better in the West. So these guys don't like the open grassland, but they do like forest. They're also quite tolerant of people. They're becoming more common in the Okanagan. So in the 80s, you probably wouldn't have seen very many of them at all if you could even find them in the Okanagan, but they are quite common. They're residents, so they're here year-round. And they also breed quite early. The mnemonic to sort of try and remember their call is "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" So the last of our big owls that we're going to talk about is the great gray owl. So the great gray owl is another very large owl. This owl has a rounded head, but yellow eyes, not the black eyes. And he's got a white bow tie under his chin, which looks very dapper when he's sitting, particularly. They're also residents, so they're here year round, but at higher elevations. So you're not going to find great gray owls in the valley bottom. They're going to be up kind of more towards the ski hills. These guys really like forest edge, so they like an open meadow, but they like to also have forest to go back to. They have a low tone, kind of monotone hoot that lasts for 6 to 8 seconds. All right, so northern Sawet owls, we've now jumped sizes dramatically. So we've gone from the really big owls to the really small owls. Sawet owls are about the size of a robin. They've got round heads without ear tufts. Their heads are sort of almost square looking. They're just like a really big, wide head on their bodies. They have a brown back with little white spots and a pale belly with sort of indistinct vertical streaking. Sawet owls were named for their call, which apparently sounds like a saw blade being sharpened. Probably a more familiar sound for you guys would be a truck backing up, and they do sound like a truck backing up in the middle of a forest. So if you're out in a forest and you hear a truck backing up, it could be a northern Sawet owl. They are resident in the Okanagan, although they do move around somewhat from winter to summer, and they're more likely to be closer to people during the winter, so you're more likely to see them in the winter. They breed in about March. They'll start calling in February, and so have a listen to the truck backing up. This is the only juvenile that I have included in this slideshow. The northern Sawet juveniles, when they first fledge, look fairly different to the adults. You can see they're sort of a chocolate brown on their backs with that really white Y in between their eyes and a very buffy breast. So the northern pygmy owl is another very small owl, about the size of a blackbird. One of the interesting things about northern pygmy owls is that they're very active during the day. They primarily hunt other smaller birds, so they can be attracted to bird feeders where birds are congregating. You can see that they have a dark head and back with those little white spots, a white belly with dark streaks, and they also have eye spots on the backs of their heads. Their hoots are very similar to the northern Sawet, but they're just spaced further apart. Northern pygmy owls are migratory, and although some are thought to breed in the Okanagan during the summer, you're much more likely to see them during the winter. There's a much higher density of pygmy owls here during the winter. So this is the western screech owl. This is the first of our at-risk owls. The western screech owl is very dependent on riparian ecosystems, so forests that are found beside rivers and creeks and streams. They particularly like to nest in old cottonwood trees that have had limbs fall off and become rotten. So they are cavity nesters. They like to nest in holes, but they can't excavate holes themselves. So they either need a good-sized woodpecker to make a hole that they can then use, or to find a hole from natural rotting processes. These guys will also use nest boxes, and the Okanagan Simlkameen Stewardship Society also does put out some nest boxes. So if you think you have appropriate habitat and you would like a nest box, then get in touch with us. So western screech owls, as we previously mentioned, they've got small ear tufts that may or may not be visible depending on how they're sitting. They're very, very well camouflaged. They're quite small. They're about the size of a robin. They've got yellow eyes. They've got vertical streaking with sort of spidery horizontal streaks coming off. And in spite of being called screech owls, their calls sound more like a ping pong ball that's been dropped, and the ball hitting the ground gets kind of closer together as you go. So I'll play it for you. Western screech owls are resident, although they might move away from those riparian wet forests during the winter up into sort of different drier habitats, and they'll start breeding around March. Another at-risk owl species in the Okanagan is the burrowing owl. These guys are actually listed as extirpated, so they're extinct in BC. They are being reintroduced into BC, so there's a possibility that you'll see them depending on where you are. If you do see one, you're asked to stay well back, at least 50 meters away from the birds, particularly during breeding season between April and July. But if you do see one and you happen to get a picture where you can see a band number like you can on this one, then please send it to the Burrowing Owl Society of BC. And if you want to learn more about the reintroduction program, then check out the Burrowing Owl website, which is on this slide. So these guys are found in grasslands. If you're in a treed area or you're seeing an owl in a tree, it's very likely not a burrowing owl. They're a small owl, a little bigger than some of the ones we've been talking about. They're about the size of a quail. Although you did see the picture of one in a coffee cup, so they're still quite small. They've got that very large white eyebrow and white chin strap. Their call is almost like a pigeon cuckooing. They are found primarily during the summer. Occasionally they will try and overwinter. Generally they're around from about April until October. The other noise you might hear from a burrowing owl is if you're hiking and you get too close to one, you might hear their alarm call. And for all of these owls, there's a lot more calls that they can make. I've just put in their sort of most common, iconic hooting territorial breeding call. If you hear a noise and it's not one of these, you can go online, you can check out all of these calls. We've actually borrowed from the Audubon website. They have lots of options. You can try and figure it out there. If you can get a recording of it, there's a couple of apps that can help you ID them from sound. This is a picture of Penticton, and it's taken from Wiltsey Mountain. And what you can see in this picture is a lot of green space in the mountains and a lot of city in the valley bottom. So we talked about different habitats that different owls use. And any owls that want to use those valley bottom habitats are likely experiencing some kind of habitat loss. So this is not to pick on Penticton. There's a similar pattern throughout the rest of the Okanagan as well, that the valley bottoms are really heavily populated by people and the mountaintops are a lot more natural. So what can you do about habitat loss? If you have natural habitat on your property, you can hang on to natural habitat and keep it natural. If there's natural habitat in your neighborhood that is important to you, then you can be an advocate for it. Owls often need older trees, and they particularly use wildlife trees, which are trees that are dead or dying. So a lot of our smaller owls in particular are cavity nesters, so they need those large trees that are starting to rot, that have holes in them, in order to be able to breed. This is a picture of eagles in a tree, obviously not owls. Most owls won't really make their own nests. They'll take over nests from other bird species. So if you think about our big owls, our great horned owls, for instance, they'll often take over hawk nests or crow's nests. They start breeding really early, so they're able to kind of get there before anyone else comes back to it. So these dead trees that are often seen as sort of unsightly or a fire hazard, they're sometimes removed for those reasons. It's really important for birds and other wildlife species to hang on to those. And when we talked about the western screech owl, we did talk about nest boxes. This is a western screech owl peeking out of a nest box. So again, if you have appropriate habitat and you want a nest box, check out our website. There's nest box plans on there. And if you're interested in signing a stewardship agreement, we might be able to help you out with one. What else threatens owls? So loss of prey. And in the first half of the webinar, we talked about what owls eat. Some owls will eat insects, other owls eat rodents or birds. So there has been quite a dramatic decline in insects, particularly flying insects, over the last 50 years. It's not entirely clear what has caused all of the decline in insect life. A lot of it is likely linked back to pesticide use. So reduce your own personal pesticide use whenever you can. Another threat to owls is poisoned rodents. So one of the most common ways of controlling problem rodents is to put out poison for them. And those animals don't die right away. So these animals, they eat the poison, and they start to digest it, and basically they become poison themselves. They wander away from wherever the bait was laid out, and they can be eaten by owls, by other predators like coyotes, hawks, and also by things like dogs and cats. So what you can do, don't poison rodents and insects whenever possible. So snap traps are a pretty humane alternative. If they're set up correctly, they should break the rodent's neck. They're not appropriate for all types of rodents. So something like moles, you would need a different sort of a trap to be able to target those. Another thing is that feral cats and outdoor cats, so like barn cats, are what's known as a subsidized predator. They stay in a very localized area. They're generally fed at least a little bit by people. And so they can really drive down rodent numbers and bird numbers to below what you would find in nature. They're efficient predators. They don't hunt just when they're hungry. They'll hunt all the time. And because you can have high populations of them living in small areas, they can have a very negative impact on those food species for owls. In addition, some of our big owls, we talked about this in the first webinar as well, some of the big owls like great horned owls will also occasionally kill and eat cats. Or they will go after small dogs if they're outside on their own. So be careful with your pets outdoors. Other things that are problematic for owls: vehicle strikes, window strikes, barbed wire fencing and netting, and electrocution. So we'll just kind of go down the list. Vehicle strikes, particularly barn owls are prone to vehicle strikes, although it does happen to most owl species. Most owls like kind of edge habitats. They'll see that wide open road and often like the grassy, gravelly verge beside the road. And And so they'll see rodents kind of running around in there, swoop down to go get a rodent and get hit by a car. So make sure you're not throwing anything out of your car, not even organics like banana peels or apples. Banana peels and apples can attract things like rodents and insects, and that attracts bigger animals and increases the risk of a vehicle strike. Window strikes, more of a problem for some of the smaller owls. Large office towers are a problem for migrating birds in general, because, and large apartment buildings, because the lights that are on in the buildings confuse them. And birds can end up circling the skyscrapers and getting lost, getting tired, exhausted, and colliding with windows. There's all kinds of bird decals and other options of things you can do on your windows to help reduce the likelihood that birds are going to impact them. Even if the owls aren't directly hitting the windows, again, it's their food. So many owl species will eat birds. And so anything you can do to help birds will also help owls. Barbed wire fences. Owls are obviously often flying around quite late at night when it's quite dark. Fences are pretty hard to see. And so they can hit the barbed wire fences when they're going for prey and become entangled in the barbs. One thing you can do when you're setting up barbed wire fences is to have round wire for the top strand and the bottom strand. Obviously, cattle don't do very well with round wire fences. They don't have a lot of respect for them. So you need to have some kind of a compromise there. But having round wire on the top for the top strand and the bottom strand at least reduces the amount of barbed wire that's out there and makes it easier for all kinds of animals to get past those fences. Netting in orchards and vineyards, particularly if it's loose netting, owls can get tangled up in it. Other things can also get tangled up in it, and then hawks and owls can see the snake or the rodent that's stuck in there, or the bird, and it leads to the larger animals getting stuck. If you do want to have netting to try and protect your fruit from birds, make sure it's not touching the ground and make sure it's tight. Loose netting like this is particularly problematic. Electrocution. Owls like to sit on telephone poles and on power lines. And because they're such big-bodied birds, they can often touch two parts or two wires at once, or a live wire in part of the pole. There are ways that power companies can try and retrofit their equipment if there's problematic areas. So if you ever happen to find a dead or injured owl underneath a power line, make note of where it is. If it's a high problem area, then the power companies can make changes to try and help owls out. What else can you do to help owls? If you want to attract them to your property, you can try a T-post. That can be a simple T-post that's just a post with a T on it, or like we're seeing in the bottom right here, the double T-post. The double T-post is nice because it gives the owls a little bit of cover from above. Particularly some of the smaller owls and hawks as well like to have that cover above them. Make sure that you're being responsible when you're out and looking at owls. So you see this guy who's taking a picture of an elk and feeding it. You definitely want to keep well back from any wildlife when you're outside. Owls are a very charismatic group of species. People really like them, and they can become sort of minor celebrities. If you get too close to an owl, particularly a nocturnal owl during the day, you can scare them and flush them out of their hiding spot. And once they're out, other bird species will mob them, and sometimes it can result in the death of the owl. And finally, don't steal owl babies. So top right there, there's a sort of a blurry picture of a juvenile great horned owl, and he looks like he's just about ready to start flying. He's still very fluffy, and you can see that he's on a skinny branch. He's not where his nest is. So often owls will start to fly just a little bit before they're really good at it. So what often ends up happening, young owls will leave the nest, they'll fly, and then they'll end up on the ground. And that's okay. That's a natural part of their fledging process. They're quite good at climbing up tree trunks using their beaks and their talons. So if they're left alone for a little while, away from people and pets, so make sure you keep your dogs away from them, then they'll generally be able to climb up a tree, get up to a safe height. Their parents will still be around and feeding them. If you, with the best intention, grab the owl, then it can be hard to get it back to its parents, and rehab centers can be stuck trying to feed it and get it back out in the wild, which is not the best start for an owl. The parents are way better at teaching them how to be an owl than we are. If you haven't seen our other webinars, please go check them out. We have a beginner birding series and a series on snakes. And thank you very much to our funders.